Hey, what's going on, guys? Nathan here from Slaughter Productions, back again with another Commander deck tech video. I heard through my YouTube surveys that you guys enjoy budget deck techs, and so today we are going over a $300 budget Necrobloom deck tech, which I actually looked through YouTube and I did not see a budget version of the Necrobloom that was within a reasonable price range. Some people tend to make budget deck techs that are, below $100, and I just feel like you don't get quite the amount of power out of a commander by only spending $100 on it. And so we're going to clock in right around that $300 mark for the Necrobloom, and I will take you through what this deck is planning to do. And at the end of the video, actually in the comment section below, I'll throw in some higher budget options if you want to replace some of these cards and you have a little bit more money to spend. Then you can most certainly make the upgrades that I'll recommend down in the comments below, because landfall decks tend to be very expensive because a lot of the same pieces are coveted by many different decks. And so the price tends to just be very high because there's so much demand. And also I'd just say landfall in general is a very popular archetype because it takes, it really sort of abuses the social contract within Commander, which is that generally people won't mess with your lands, and this deck is no different. And so we'll get into that in a little bit. But before we do, I'd just like to ask if you enjoy this type of content, leave a like on the video and subscribe to keep up to date with all of my Commander content. I would appreciate it immensely. So let's jump into the commander. The Necrobloom is a 4-mana Absent commander, 2 power, 7 toughness creature plant. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 0/1 green plant creature token. If you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token instead. And land cards in your graveyard have dredge 2, which means you may return a land card from your graveyard to your hand and mill 2 cards instead of drawing a card. Now I will say one neat little quality of life thing that you can do for this deck is to create a little reminder, or even just use like a coin or something that you happen to have on hand, put it on top of your deck so that you are always reminded of that dredge ability when you have the Necrobloom on the field. I frequently find myself forgetting about that dredge trigger because online it would pop up and give you the option, but in paper you just have to remember. And so that's just a nice little quality of life improvement that you can make. But essentially, just as every other deck tech before me has said, this is essentially Field of the Dead on a stick. And of course, we are running the Field of the Dead land itself, and we are looking to essentially get Field of the Dead onto the field every single game, and we have a bunch of tutors to ensure that happens. Once we get Field of the Dead onto the battlefield, we're looking to clone it with various effects such as Thespian Stage, which we can pay 2 and tap it to have it become a copy of target land. There's also Vesuva, which enters tapped as a copy of any land on the battlefield. And there is also an additional effect here with Echoing Deeps that says you may have Echoing Deeps enter the battlefield tapped as a copy of any land card in your graveyard if we do find that Field of the Dead is in our graveyard and we haven't yet gotten it onto the field. Now, the key thing here is to find Field of the Dead and then to preferably mass reanimate a bunch of lands onto the battlefield. We have a few ways to do that, but in this deck, we want to be holding back a little bit in the early game, really just sort of self-milling, playing a little bit of solitaire to ensure we're not very threatening. Then we want to slam the Necrobloom and then play Field of the Dead and then use one of our mass land reanimation effects. So before I get into the individual cards, I actually want to go over some stats as I typically do in my deck techs here. Let's scroll down to our mana costs. So once we actually adjust for custom mana costs, things like X spells and so forth, the average CMC of this deck is 3.47, and here you can get an idea of the curve. So we're really heavy on the 2 and 3 drops, which is very intentional because we want to be doing a lot of setup before the Necrobloom gets on the field. And then for our lands, we are running mostly black and green mana producers with a little bit of white. We have 16 tap lands and 21 untapped lands. That is a result of this being a budget build. If you had more budget, you could definitely throw in all of the fetch lands that have lands enter untapped, in addition to other lands such as Fabled Passage or Prismatic Vista that does the same thing. It's just that in our budget range, these are just not really an option. And so I cut those for the more tapped lands such as Evolving Wilds and so forth. We also are running one combo in the deck. So Kodama of the East Tree actually combos with all bounce lands. And if you have the Necrobloom or Field of the Dead on the battlefield, how this works is essentially every time that you have a land enter the battlefield, you will have a Kodama trigger to allow you to if you have a token enter the battlefield, Kodama will trigger to then allow you to put a land into play because the token is CMC 0, and so you put a bounce land into play. And so if you then return the the bounce land to your hand, you can then essentially a token will be made off of the Necrobloom, which would allow you to then put the bounce land into play, which will create another token, and so forth, so on and so forth. And so you get infinite creature tokens and infinite landfall triggers. So let's jump into our category analysis here, which I have handy dandy in an Excel file. So we're running 37 lands, which I think is appropriate. Normally in landfall decks, I would go a little bit higher, except that this one generates a lot of lands into the graveyard. And so we actually don't need to draw a lot of lands because we're going to be reanimating them. For example, in my AC landfall deck, I think that deck runs between 39 and 40, but you can get away more with 37 just because we have so much land at our disposal in our graveyard. Then we are running a lot of ramp and self-mill, and that's going to be the bulge at the 2 and 3 mana curve that you saw before. So a lot of our ramp pieces are going to be tutors for non-basic lands that can get Field of the Dead and all of the copy lands. And then self-mill is going to be pretty heavy around the 2 curve because early on, turns 1 and 2, we definitely want to be self-milling cards into our graveyard. We've got 11 finishers, which I'm grouping this as essentially overruns. So it's going to be mass buffs for our tokens that are then generated from the Necrobloom, and also just big landfall effects. So like Skewed Swarm we are including, and Avenger of Zendikar as well. Those are grouped into the finishers category here because by themselves they can basically close out a game. And then we've got some draw spells, which by the way, this is set up intentionally. So if we look at our different columns here, we have our amount in column E, but then in column F and column G, we can see an approximation for what we would see in an opening hand, and then how much we would see in an average game. A game meaning that we would see about 20 cards from the top of our deck. So if I go back to our ramp and self-mill category, we're on average going to have one of those in our hand whenever we draw our opening 7, and that's very intentional because we want to be able to tutor for Field of the Dead or any sort of ramp effect. And then we also want to be self-milling as well in that turns 1 and 2, and so we're pretty heavy in these categories. But I will note in our draw category, we do have a couple more options that allow us to self-mill, which I'll cover once we go into the individual cards. And then removal, I think we're a little bit light here at only 8. Typically, I like to have about 10 to 11 targeted removal or some sort of mass edict type of effect in my deck. But we are running, I will say, Soul Shatter, Flare of Malice, which are both great edicts to have. And so those will hit multiple things. And we're also running Rise of the Witch King, which is another edict effect as well. So we can snipe multiple creatures with these cards. So we're being very efficient with this category, I will say. But I think, in hindsight, maybe this could be upticked a little bit more if you're in a meta with absolute must-kill commanders. And then we are running 5 total mass reanimation effect. So 4 of these will reanimate all of our lands to the battlefield, which is one of the primary game plans that we want. And then we do also have, I'm grouping Victimize within the mass reanimate category. So, take that with a little grain of salt here. And then we have 1 board wipe and then 2 other. So the other, which I'll cover super quick here, let's just actually kick off our card discussion here by covering our other cards, is Dark Depths. So with Dark Depths, it enters the battlefield with 10 ice counters on it. And then we're not going to worry about actually paying mana to remove it because it says whenever Dark Depths has no ice counters on it, sack it. If you do create Merit Lage, a legendary 2020 black avatar creature token with flying and indestructible. So if you actually, for some reason, if we don't have our Field of the Dead on hand, we can tutor for Dark Depths. And then if you have any land that will enter as a copy of Hey folks, Editor Nathan here. I actually explain how the Dark Depths combo works incorrectly in this video, so I'm just going to mute my past self and explain it here. If you have a Thespian stage on the field with Dark Depths and you activate the Thespian stage's copy ability, it skips adding the ice counters to the copy, and so it will be sacrificed right away to create Merit Lage. So that's how that works. It does not die to the Legend rule, which is how I initially explained it. You need specifically Thespian stage to not get that ETB trigger with the ice counters. And then we already sort of talked about the Kodama combos as well. So let me actually scroll up here. Let's go into the early game, I think, starting with our ramp category, probably our most important category within the deck. Crop rotation is going to be great because we can put a land into our graveyard for reanimation later, and then it actually allows us to search for any land card, namely Field of the Dead, put that right on the battlefield, not even tapped, and then shuffle. Elvish Rejuvenator is going to be a very simple ramp effect. One thing you'll notice in this deck is there are not as many there are plenty of fetch effects, I will say, where you are tutoring to your library. One of my prime pet peeves with landfall decks is when you pack too many tutoring effects, because you are then always shuffling your library, and it is so annoying to just sit there and shuffle and shuffle and shuffle. Some of these card options are because of that, Elvish Rejuvenator being one of them, where instead of running like a Wood Elves or something that would put that land onto the battlefield, this can not only grab us a non-basic land from our deck, but also we just look at the top 5 instead of having to search through our library. And so I just wanted to mention that. I believe this deck runs a total of 19 total tutor effects. So you're going to be tutoring a bit, but it's not as heavy as most of them. Hour of Promise, 5 mana spell that allows us to search up 2 land cards and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Most of the time, I would say 99% of the time, you're going to be tutoring up Field of the Dead and Vesuva to then have 2 Field of the Deads on the battlefield. Hour of Promise is one of the best spells in the deck. I will say every time you see this, you are happy to see it. Knight of the Reliquary can also tap to sack a forest or plains and search your library for a land card, put it on a battlefield, then shuffle. This can, of course, grab us Field of the Dead or any or the Dark Depths or anything like that. We're running plenty of forests and plains, so that stipulation shouldn't be an issue. And also, it will be a big chunky boy because it gets +1/+1 for each land card in our graveyard. Millikin is actually a nice cheap little option that accomplishes 2 things. First, it mills cards, and it also just ramps us, so it's a great turn 2 play because then turn 3 we can mill a card. And then also it is nice because it is colorless, so if for some reason you don't have the necessary colors to cast what you want to cast on turn 2, maybe you're missing black or something like that, then you can play Millikin, don't have to worry about the color stipulations, so that's pretty nice. And it just does a nice 2-for-1 job for only 35 cents. Sowing Mycospawn is going to allow us to search our library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield, and then if we kick it, we can exile target land, so a little bit of niche synergy there. And there are plenty of lands that generate the waste color, I will say. It's like Demolition Field, for example, Echoing Deeps, and then there's a few others, I believe, here. Field of the Dead obviously taps for that, so that should be pretty easy to pay that kicker cost in terms of meeting that waste color restriction. Spelunking is great. It's 3 mana enchantment. When it ETBs, draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. We're not going to worry about the caves. And then lands you control enter the battlefield untapped, which is pretty great because a lot of our land reanimation effects will put all of our lands from the graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. And so if you have Spelunking on the battlefield, you can use that immediately and just absolutely go off, basically win the game on the spot. And also no tutor effect, but we get to put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield, which is absolutely great. Springbloom Druid is going to allow us to get 2 landfall triggers. This is one of those cards where I was hesitant to include it because it's just yet another tutor effect that will slow down the game, but the 2 landfall effects is pretty worth it, and so it is in the deck for 3 mana. Tempt with Discovery is going to allow us to, again, search for Field of the Dead, put it onto the battlefield, although how I would typically play this card is to politic with your opponents first to see if they will take the offer. And what I would in fact do If you have another way to search for Field of the Dead in your hand, then I would actually just lead with your first land as just a basic or something very simple like a brush land, for example, because how this card technically works is that you have to search your library first and put that card on a battlefield. Then your opponents decide in order whether they will take the offer as well. And so if you get Field of the Dead, then people will generally be pretty scared and not take the offer. But if you can maybe convince them and they don't really quite know the goal of your deck, although, I mean, Necrobloom is pretty kind of a poster boy for what the deck is looking to do, but if they somehow don't know what your deck is going to do, just grab a nice harmless land and then say, you know, if you take the deal, I will only take, you know, this land, right? Give them a land, and then you can possibly use it more as a ramp spell than a tutor for Field of the Dead. And so there's sort of a dual modality that you can use with this card. You can either just pay 4 mana, tutor for Field of the Dead, put on a battlefield, or you could try to ramp for 4 more harmless lands, and you could get potentially 4 landfall triggers. Then we have Tireless Provisioner, which I cannot believe is only a $2 or $3 card. Landfall, whenever land you control enters, create a food or treasure token. Obviously, treasure token most of the time we're going to be taking, but in a pinch you can create those food tokens to crack them to survive in the late game. Vengeful Regrowth, 6 mana sorcery, return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped, and then create that many 4/2 green plant warrior creature tokens with reach. And the reason why this card is amazing is because it has flashback for 8. So oftentimes when you're in these types of landfall decks, you have all of these lands on the battlefield and you're looking for something to use it on, and Vengeful Regrowth gives you a nice mana sink to keep doing your game plan. And so it does everything we want to do, really. It reanimates the lands, it creates the tokens, which we're going to use to overrun our opponents, and then it has a flashback for 8, which is pretty great. Wayward Sawtooth gives us an extra land drop on each of our turns. Quite simply, the only reason why this is run is it is cheaper than Azusa, for example, which would otherwise give us 2 additional land drops, but that is like a $15 card, and so we run Wayward Sawtooth instead. And then White of the Reliquary is 2 mana 2/2 zombie knight with vigilance. It gets +++ for each creature card in your graveyard, and we can sack another creature. And I find that with this deck we typically have a lot of plants laying around that are ready to be sacrificed, so we can sack another creature, probably a plant, to search your library for a land card, put it on a battlefield tapped, then shuffle. So it really trades those useless little plant tokens for lands, which is pretty great. All right, so if we are not ramping, we want to be self-milling in the early game. So this is our self-mill category. We have 13 options here. Blanchwood Prowler is going to be 2 mana 1/1. We mill 3, then we may put a land card from among the cards milled this way into our hand, so we can grab a Field of the Dead out of that grouping if it is in there. Eccentric Farmer, 3 mana 2/3. When ATBs mill 3, then you may return a land card from a graveyard to your hand. So basically a more inefficient version of Blanchwood. However, this will open up the land grab from our entire graveyard instead of just the 3 that we mill, so that's very nice as well. Hermit Druid is the second most expensive card in the deck, Field of the Dead being first, and it allows us to pay 1, tap it to reveal cards from the top of your library, and to reveal a basic, put that card into your hand and all other revealed cards into your graveyard. And so when we look at the number of basics, initially when I was plotting out this deck, I was thinking, oh, maybe we'll only have 4 or 5 basics. But with a lot of the fetch lands that we're running, like Broker's Hideout, I felt and I noticed in playtesting that the deck needed a lot more basics. And so what we're really running is, I believe, a total of 9 basics. We have, let's see, so 2 forest, 1 plains, 2 snow-covered forest, a snow-covered plains, a snow-covered swamp, so that's 7, 2, and then 2 swamps is 9 total basics. So on average, when we activate Hermit Druid, assuming that we've already have either a basic in our hand or on the field somehow, maybe in our graveyard, then we'll mill about 1/8 of our deck, which is still pretty decent. That's about, I don't know, 7 to 10 cards, somewhere around there, depending on what turn it is. But Hermit Druid is going to be essentially the best mill effect in the deck, arguably, and so that's why it is in here as a very expensive card, but it is so worth it because it is your perfect turn 2 play so that you can mill a ton of cards on turn 3. Incarnation Technique lets us mill a total of 10 cards and then return 2 creature cards from our graveyard to the battlefield, as long as we let an opponent also mill 5 cards, then reanimate reanimate a creature card. And what I did in this deck is I tried to substitute a lot of the powerful sorceries that you might find in a landfall deck with creatures so that our reanimation style of effects would be more potent. For example, if we were to take Graz Unstoppable Juggernaut, for example, one of the budget options as sort of a quote-unquote overrun effect, instead of running something like Last March of the Ents, which is an 8 mana, that spews a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, or Rise of the Dark Realms, 9 mana, reanimate all creatures from all graveyards on the battlefield under your control. These are creatures so that we can hit them with our reanimation style of effects to generate as much soft synergy as we can. Life from the Loam is going to be one of the best cards to see early on. 2 mana sorcery, return up to 3 target land cards from your graveyard to your hand, basically says in a self-mill deck to draw 3 cards, and then it has dredge 3, so as soon as we use it and it goes into the graveyard on our next turn on that draw trigger, we can then dredge 3 to then mill 3 cards and return it again. And so you can really just keep looping this back and forth to just draw a bunch of lands, and it is fantastic. Mesmeric Orb, another expensive card at about $15, but this is one of the best mill effects in the deck, again, because whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card for only 2 mana. In very niche scenarios, this functions as a win con as well. I believe on a Game Nights episode at some point, somebody did end up milling another person out with a Mesmeric Orb, and so if this stays on the battlefield long enough, this can potentially actually kill people, but obviously we're using it for the mill effects, and for only 2 colorless mana of any color, we can essentially mill between 15 and 20 cards over the course of 3 or 4 turns, which is absolutely fantastic. Ransack the Lab, new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and I think this one is being overlooked. This is a great vegetable option in a budget land reanimator deck. Only 2 mana for sorcery that says look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. So it essentially says surveil 3 and draw a card, right? Something like that. So you're getting that card selection, it's replacing itself, and you're milling at the same time for only 2 mana. So this just does everything we want to be doing on turn 2 and turn 3, which is why I'm running it. And it's only a common card and only costs 35 cents. So great vegetable card in a land reanimator deck. Ripples of Undeath, similar logic here. 2 mana enchantment at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, mill 3 cards. So we don't get the mill effect right away, but we can pay 1 colorless and 3 life when we do. And if we do that, we can put a card from among those cards into our hand. So this basically allows us to draw an extra card for 1 colorless and 3 life each turn, which is absolutely awesome. I will say the life tends to add up before you start to not want to pay for this mana wise. So what you want to do is probably take, I would say, between 2 or 3 cards off of this Ripples of Undeath over the course of 2 or 3 turns, because that life tends to add up, and so you just want to be careful about that. But it always just gives you the option, so you don't have to take that card. But this is a great source of self-mill as well, and of course, being an enchantment is a little bit harder to interact with. Satyr Wayfinder, very basic common here, 35 cents when ETBs reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them into your hand, put the rest into your graveyard. So this is pretty efficient. We get 3 cards into our graveyard and a land into our hand. 6 has some great synergy in the deck. It's a little spendy at around $5, but 6 is a 3 mana 2/4 Tree Folk with reach. Whenever it attacks, mill 3 cards. You may put a land card from among them into your hand. So it will actually replace itself with a land essentially and mill us at the same time. And it says, as long as it's your turn, non-land permanent cards in your graveyard have retrace, which means you may cast permanent cards from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying their other costs. Now, what's interesting about this is with the Necrobloom on the battlefield, we can use that dredge trigger. Let me go back to 6 here. We can use that dredge trigger. So let's say that we start our turn and then we use our dredge 2 to mill 2 and return a land card card from our graveyard to your hand. Okay, so that's given us the fuel to discard a land card via Six's ability, which means now essentially we can always play out of our graveyard while Six is on the battlefield. And then what you can also do is you can put lands into your graveyard that you want into your graveyard. Let's say you have a giant mass land reanimation effect like our Lumra, Bella of the Woods, for example. You might want to actually chuck a few lands into your graveyard by just discarding a couple of lands and, you know, paying for a Rite of Harmony or something out of your graveyard so that you can get those lands into your graveyard to then reanimate later. So there's just a ton of synergy here, and the only thing I would say is that it does have 4 toughness, but be careful when you send it into combat. This might be a creature that you might want to politic and say, hey opponent, will you just let me hit you for 2 so that my 6 can survive, because I want to mill 3 cards and draw a land essentially. So it's something that you can sort of work around, but it's pretty fragile in the late game once it starts attacking, because it would only be able to attack by around turn 4, and so just be careful that you don't want to send this willy-nilly into combat. Then we have Stitcher Supplier, classic turn 1 play, 1 mana 1/1 when it ETBs or dies, mill 3 cards. And then we can also equip our Skull Clamp to Stitcher Supplier to then basically draw 2 cards and mill 3 cards at the same time, which is pretty great. Tapping at the Window, another vegetable card similar to Ransack the Lab, I think is overlooked. 2 mana sorcery, look at the top 3. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest into your graveyard, and notably it has flashback for 2 and a green, which is great because if we're not drawing our self-mill, or let's say we've used this and that's our only self-mill option we've drawn, then we can just use it again out of the graveyard, and we're happy to pay 3 mana to then mill more cards into our graveyard, and that is for only 35 cents. So pretty good option there. And I just want to cover our types as well really quickly. So we are running a total of 31 creatures, and so your chance to hit off of that is pretty decent. It's probably, actually, let's pull this up. Let's do some back of the napkin math here. So if we have 31 creatures and tapping at the window draws, let me see here. What do we look at? We look at the top 3. So if we got 31 divided by 99 times 3, so on average, we're going to see 1 creature out of there to actually draw it. But even if we don't draw it, 2 mana mill 3 is not bad either, if we're really desperate for it. And then we have Undead Butler, 2 mana 1/2, when ETBs mill 3, and then when it dies, we can exile it, and when you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So a nice finisher, perhaps an Elesh Norn, we can return to our hand if that gets milled over. All right, now let's go over some of the big bomb type of effects, because the idea would be to ramp then, or self-mill, ramp, and then reanimate a bunch of lands out of the graveyard. And so we're going to go to the big splashy effects here. Aftermath Analyst, 2 mana 1/3, when it ETBs mill 3 cards, and we can pay 4 and sack it to return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. An absolutely excellent card because you can pay this in installments. And I will say too, we are running a couple of options here. So for example, Sevinne's Reclamation will allow us to return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And so we're running a lot of these options that are mana value 3 or less, particularly Aftermath Analyst. So in Magical Christmas Land, of course, we can then essentially, recur Aftermath Analyst a couple of times if we happen to get Sevinne's Reclamation after we reanimate all of our lands. And then we have Lumra, Bella of the Woods, relatively new card, quite expensive. I believe it's the 3rd or 4th most expensive card in the deck, but it is worth it because 6 mana star, Vigilance, Reach, Elemental Bear. Its power toughness each equal to the number of lands you control, and when it enters, mill 4 cards, then return all land cards from graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is our biggest bomb, our best piece we want to see on turn 5 or turn 6. This is absolutely perfect, and the fact that it also mills incidentally is pretty funny as well, but just a great option there. And then Splendid Reclamation, a sorcery that allows us to do the same thing, very plain Jane design, and of course you can see, I believe, Ren and 6 in this artwork as well, so just a great option for $5. Then let's jump into more of the general reanimation category. So Eerie Ultimatum, again, another expensive card here, but it is so worth it. So sorcery for 7 mana, and I will say this deck is pretty good at generating the color pips necessary to meet this, so I don't think it's really a concern to meet these different color pips. Return any number of permanent cards with different names from your graveyard to the battlefield, so it grabs both our graveyard and our lands, which is awesome. And then we've got Victimize, so we can sack a creature, and if we do, return 2 cards from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. This is great at grabbing our giant finishers. For example, we can sack a dumb plant token to reanimate perhaps a Kamal Heart of Kroza, which allows us to give our creatures +3/+3 and trample. We could grab a Titania Protector of Argoth, which reanimates a land, or we could grab our Graz, which makes all of our creatures 5/3, or Elish Norn, which gives our creatures +2 and all of our opponent's creatures -2/-2. So just a great efficient spell here, and Victimize is only 50 cents, which is why it definitely deserves a spot here. And then let's cover our card draw, and then we'll touch on our removal categories last. So our draw and card advantage category is trying to do double duty in putting cards into the graveyard at the same time that we are drawing them. So we are running Dire Sight, which is a relatively new card. 3 mana sorcery, surveil 2, then draw 2 cards, you lose 2 life. Now, most people would think that this looks just like a divination and is not worth it, but in a self-milled deck, that surveil 2 is absolutely huge because that is going to generate us lands that we can reanimate later. So it really says, if you sort of do a little bit of mental gymnastics here, surveil 2, if we put the 2 cards into our graveyard and then draw 2 cards, we've really drawn 4 cards for 3 mana and 2 life. And so that is definitely worth it. And it is incredible, an incredible vegetable card for only 30 cents at the common level. Eternal Witness, classic staple of the format. When you ETBs, you may return target card from a graveyard to your hand. This can grab us, of course, Field of the Dead if we've milled over it, or our important sorceries such as Splendid Reclamation, given that a lot of our instants and sorceries are not as reanimatable as our creatures. Then we have Peerless Recycling, a new card from Bloomburrow, 2 mana instant. We can gift a card, which we're going to be doing most of the time. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. If the gift was promised, instead return 2 target permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. And at instant speed, this is always going to feel great in your hand because it is just a better Eternal Witness, right? It's the same effect, but you get 2 cards. Granted, they're restricted to the permanent category, but we're going to be caring about creatures and lands anyway. And so we will gift that card in a heartbeat in order to pay only 2 mana to essentially tutor for 2 cards out of our graveyard, which is absolutely awesome. Rite of Harmony is going to be pretty great as well with graveyard decks. 2 mana instant, whenever creature or enchantment enters the battlefield under your control this turn, draw a card. So it's a one-time effect, but often if we have a bunch of lands to reanimate with Necrobloom on the field, we essentially say, you know, every time we play a land, draw a card, which is incredibly powerful and will draw you a ton of cards. And it's a little bit more inefficient, but the reason why it's also in this deck is because it has flashback. And so if we mill this over, we can, and we know we have a big lands turn coming and we need to refill our hand, then we can flash this back and then reanimate a bunch of lands, draw a bunch of cards, and boom, we have a fresh hand, and we didn't even use, quote unquote, a card for it. Then we have, technically, this card is Blex Vexing Pest, but what we're really playing it for is the backside, called Search for Blex. Now, it's a 4 mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put any number of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. You lose 3 life for each card you put into your hand this way. I think the ideal scenario for this is we probably either draw 2 or draw 3 and then put either 3 or 2 into our graveyard, respectively. And so, you know, it's tough to lose 9 life off of 1 sorcery like this, which is why I'd probably lean more towards only drawing maybe 2 of the cards and paying 6 life. But again, this is going to be doing double duty because we are drawing and putting cards into our graveyard. And for a relatively inexpensive price here, I don't think Tapped Out actually lists this, but we can look at it on Moxfield, which, yeah, I'll cover the total deck cost here in just a second. But Savine's Reclamation, 3 mana sorcery. Again, we can reanimate any permanent card of mana 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. And the beautiful thing about Savine's Reclamation, and I love this part part of the design is that we can flash it back for 5 and we get a copy of it. So we get 2 permanent cards. So it's actually more efficient to flash this back out of our graveyard than play it from our hand, which I absolutely love. So if you look at this really as an 8 mana spell to reanimate 3 permanent cards with CMC 3 less from our graveyard to the battlefield, you know, for example, if we were to reanimate a Field of the Dead, a copy land effect, and then an Aftermath Analyst, for example, although that would be a little counterintuitive because maybe the Aftermath Analyst would just reanimate the Field of the Dead anyway. But you get the point that Savine's Reclamation is going to be so flexible in this type of deck, and I absolutely love it. Skull Clamp, so we can clamp all of those plants to draw 2 cards for only 1 mana. This was an ad. Once I made the deck, I had a little bit of budget to spare, actually, and so Skull Clamp was one of the first options I included because it is so gosh darn efficient. Then we have the Gitrog monster. Again, another little bit of an expensive option here, but these are the types of cards that you want to include at the sort of $300 budget level to ensure that you have the power to compete with, you know, your sort of 7 casual decks. So the Gitrog monster, 5 mana 6/6 with Death Touch at the beginning of your upkeep. Sacrifice it unless you sacrifice a land. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. Whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. So all of a sudden now all of our self-mill spells will draw us additional cards off of the Gitrog monster, and it actually does us a favor by then forcing us to sack a land, or if we don't need to, we just sack the Gitrog monster and then maybe we can reanimate it later, but it puts lands into our graveyard, which is exactly what we want to be doing as well. And then we have a nice staple here at only 30 cents, another fantastic vegetable card, Winding Way. For only 2 mana, we choose either creature or land, reveal the top 4 cards of your library, put all cards of the chosen type reveal this way into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard, which is pretty fantastic because if we want lands into our graveyard, we'll choose creature and send all of those lands into the graveyard, or if we want it the other way around, we want lands to play, we'll choose land and then put all the creature cards into our graveyard. So it's very flexible and just a great vegetable card for this deck. Then we will cruise through the removal category. So Broken Bond is pulling double duty because it can destroy target artifact or enchantment and ramp us out a land. Flare of Malice, you may sack a non-token black creature rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Each opponent sacks a creature planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures and planeswalkers they control. So a nice Soul Shatter effect for potentially free, although I'd be happy to cast this for 4 mana just because that effect itself is so potent. Kamal's Will, 4 mana, instant, choose one if you control a commander. As you cast a spell, you may choose both. It makes all of our lands into 1/1 elemental creature tokens with vigilance, indestructible, and haste. So a nice bit of combat damage in a pinch there. And then it says choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals damage equal to its power to that creature. So basically it says destroy target creature and reanimate your lands into 1/1 vigilance, indestructible, and hasty creatures, which is absolutely fantastic. Again, pulling double duty, exactly what we want to be doing, making sure our cards are very dense. Lethal Scheme is going to be a very cheap option here, as reprinted in Fallout. 4 mana instant with Convoke. Destroy target creature or planeswalker. Each creature that convoked Lethal Scheme connives, which is awesome. So what I found in playtesting is that you have all these plants and zombies onto the battlefield. You can actually just convoke all of them, cast this for free, and then put essentially 4 cards into your graveyard and sculpt your hand, which is absolutely awesome. Then we have Lorn of the Third Path, which will allow us to destroy up to 1 target artifact or enchantment, and it is card draw in a pinch with some nice politicking ability there. Pier's Whim is going to allow us to tutor out Field of the Dead, and each opponent will sack an artifact or enchantment. So nice, again, sort of dense removal spell to make up for the fact that we're only running about 8 of these effects. Rise of the Witch King, 4 mana sorcery. Each player sacks a creature. If you sacked a creature this way, you may return another permanent card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So not just creatures, and I cannot believe this card is only 50 cents. So again, this could reanimate Field of the Dead or just a big bomb creature for only 4 mana, which is just so good with an Edict on top. And we have format staple Soul Shatter, 3 mana instant. Each opponent sacks a creature planeswalker with the highest CMC among creatures and planeswalkers they control for only $3. Finally, our last card here is Starfall Invocation, 5-mana sorcery. We can gift a card, destroy all creatures. If the gift was promised, return a creature card, put it into your graveyard this way to the battlefield under your control. This is my new favorite board wipe in mono white. It is better than Vanquish the Horde in my opinion, because it does what Vanquish the Horde is looking to do, which is to wipe the board and then rebuild immediately. So we're always going to be gifting that card, and this basically then reads, destroy all creatures except for your commander. Right, that is such a good effect because now we have Necrobloom. We are the first to rebuild because we had that creature enter the battlefield. Now, of course, it has to have been destroyed via this effect, and you have to choose to make it go to the command zone. But your opponents can't interact between the time it goes to the graveyard and then is returned because the spell has to fully resolve there. So it's just a fantastic card, and like even if you want something different other than the Necrobloom on the field, you can choose one of the big absolute bomb cards like Elesh Norn to stay on there. And then finally, I guess we'll go over, I'm sorry, I totally skipped over our finishers category here. We have a few finishers, big bomb spells that we want to finish the game off. So Avenger of Zendikar is going to be a classic, and this card combos so well with a new card called Fecund, Green Shell, 5 mana, 4/6, reach. As long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2, which is so easy to hit in this deck. Whenever it or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of the library. If it's a land card, you may put it out of the battlefield tapped, otherwise put it into your hand. Now let's go back to Avenger of Zendikar. As soon as this hits the field, we're making at least 7 plant tokens, regardless of what we have with the Necrobloom going on. And so that's going to get at least 7 triggers off of Fecund Green Shell, which will then pump all of our plant tokens from all of those lands entering. You know, if you consider, let's say you get out of 7 triggers, you get 3 lands on average. All of your plants are then 3/4s. And so it's just an amazing combo. I had this happen once in my gold fishing, and it was just like mind blowing. It's like, okay, we can stop the testing there because we are in a dominant position now. Beastmaster Ascension is, it says, as long as it has 7 or more quest counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5. So you want to hold this and sandbag this until you can trigger it instantly. And again, this is a good candidate for that Savine's Reclamation that I mentioned before, being only 3 mana or less. And so you want to wait until you can swing with 7 creatures to get the +5/+5, which is relatively easy to do in this deck. Elesh Norn is going to be a pseudo board wipe. It indirectly sort of says creatures you control get +4/+4, but your mileage may vary, I will say, because I very rarely, I would say only maybe once in my entire commander career have I seen this survive more than a turn. It is very oppressive for your opponents and will wipe their boards if they have pretty small utility creatures, and so it tends to be a giant target for removal. So your mileage may vary. Make sure to you use this when you think you can take out players. We already went over Fecund Green Shell, great option there, and somehow it has a reach question mark as a turtle. Felidar Retreat is going to be an excellent finisher. It allows us to landfall, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain vigilance until end of turn. So it both buffs our board and protects us against crackbacks. And also in a pinch, we can make tokens if we're struggling to keep the Necrobloom on the battlefield. We have Graz Unstoppable Juggernaut, which is the budget option of Crater Hoof Behemoth. If you're looking to upgrade, maybe I would swap these out, but essentially this just says other creatures you control have base power and toughness 5/3 and are juggernauts in addition to their creature types. So just be careful that Graz, if it is killed at instant speed and you think you have a lethal board state, then your creatures will shrink again. But other than that, I think that this serves the role of Crater Hoof Behemoth pretty well by turning all of our 2/2 zombies into 5/3s. Kamal Heart of Kroza is going to give our creatures +3/+3 and trample at the beginning of combat on our turn, and it can animate our lands into 1/1 creatures with vigilance, indestructible, and haste, which is absolutely awesome. And both sides of this card are what we want to be doing. Rumbleweed, again, you could probably replace this in a higher budget deck with like a Moonshaker Cavalry, but this is a 11 mana 8/8, but it costs 1 less to cast for each land card in your graveyard. It's a Vigilance Reach Trample, so really nice body, admittedly, and protects against flyers pretty well. When it ETBs, other creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn, which is pretty nice. Scute Swarm is going to basically double itself whenever we have landfall and control 6 or more lands. Scute Swarm gets out of hand extremely quickly, and it basically demands a board wipe or your opponents will lose. Skyhunter Strike Force is a budget option for another overrun effect. This is again in that 3 CMC range that can be grabbed with Savine's Reclamation, for example, or if you were to throw in a Sun Titan's pretty budget at this point in time. But Skyhunter Strike Force gives your creatures melee as long as you control your commander, which means whenever this creature attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each opponent you attack this combat. So assuming you swing at all of your opponents, your creatures get +3/+3, which is pretty great, for only 3 mana, by the way, and it itself is basically a 5/5 flyer. And then finally we have Titanium Protector of Argoth. When it ETBs, it animates a land, reanimates a land from a graveyard to the battlefield, and then whenever a land you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, to create a 5/3 elemental creature token. So again, all of our fetch lands and so forth, we can crack those to create 5/3s. All right, and then I'll go through really quickly the land options, because I think normally I wouldn't really focus on the lands in these types of deck techs, but in a land reanimator deck, this is actually an important part of the deck. So we have Baron Moor. All of these cycling lands have great synergy, because if we dredge 2 off of the Necrobloom and return a land to our hand, we can then pay 1 and then cycle that land back into our graveyard to then draw a card. And so I feel like there's some sort of infinite combo that can enable that, because then if you draw the card and replace it with the Dredge 2 to return the Baron Moor back, you can essentially just mill until you run out of mana, I suppose. So there's a lot of synergy there. Blighted Woodland is going to allow us to pay 4 and then tutor up 2 basic land cards on the battlefield tapped. So some nice landfall triggers there. Broker's Hideout is going to be fetch land, Brushland for the color fixing, Cabaret Courtyard for the fetch land trigger, Caves of Koilos for the fixing, Command Tower for fixing, Dakmar Salvage has Dredge 2, which is kind of nice on it, Deceptive Landscape for the fetch land trigger. Demolition Field can actually take out opposing non-basic lands on our opponent's fields, and then we also get another land trigger off of that, and we can of course reanimate it to keep doing that. Echoing Deeps, we again can enter tapped as a copy of any land card in our graveyard, and so it can copy Field of the Dead if it's in the graveyard, or any sort of fetch land, so this can really just be a fetch land as well. Escape Tunnel for the fetch land trigger, and also can, in a niche scenario, make target creature with power 2 or less unblockable. Evolving Wilds for the fetch land, Exotic Orchard for fixing, Field of the Dead, of course, we already mentioned, Golgari Rat Farm for that combo with Kodama of the East Tree, and of course you can search this up with all of your various tutor effects. Isolated Chapel for fixing, Llanowar Waste for fixing, Obscure Storefront, Plains, Riveteer's Overlook, all for fixing. We've got a few basics in here. We've got some more fixing and fetch lands. Thespian Sage, of course, can copy our Field of the Dead and any of our other lands, such as Dark Depths. Tranquil Thicket, again, for the cycling. Twilight Mire for fixing, although I may replace this with another, the Secluded Steppe land, perhaps. We'll see. Urza's Cave can tutor up any land, put it on battlefield tapped, which is great. So just a nice tutor effect on a land, and then we've got Vesuva and then another fixer here. So that is my $300 Necrobloom budget deck tech. Let me know if you guys have any other recommendations down in the comments below, and like I mentioned, I will put some higher budget options if you want to make this deck go even faster. I'll have some options for that down in the comments. You can check that out. And I think that is it. So if you guys are looking for another Abzan style of Reanimator deck, check out my Onyxia Hand of Erebos deck. I'll have the link to that in the description below. You can check that out to reanimate all of the crazy token doubling enchantments, which gets out of hand extremely quickly. And other than that, if you liked the video, leave a like on it and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content, and hopefully we'll see you all. Oh, and I always forget to mention this. I'll have a gold fishing video where I play test this deck in the description below, so you can actually watch how this deck functions and see how it plays out in real time. So stay tuned for that as well. Anyway, that is where I'll wrap up the video, guys. Thank you all for watching, subscribe, and all that stuff, and hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.